In the next 30 minutes or so, I would like to present the results of a research project which was titled How People Evaluate Anti-Corona Measures for Their Social Spheres, Attitude, Subjective Norm and Perceived Behavioral Control. The main aim of this research project was to give rather differentiated insights into people's perception and evaluation of anti-corona measures. It should be examined what is of relevance to the people, how is the attributed quality to the measures, and based on this, how can governments improve the measures they've taken. I should mention that our research focuses on Germany, but surely you can, to a certain degree, transfer the results we found here to other countries. I should mention that I did not do this on my own, but I had two partners, Ms. Hoffmann and Ms. Ruiz Fernandez, and we published an article with the same title, How People Evaluate Anti-Corona Measures for Their Social Spheres, Attitude, Subjective Norm and Perceived Behavioral Control, in Frontiers in Psychology, and the publishing date was the 12th of November. So this article is freely accessible. You'll find a link to the article in the description of this video or my website godperson.online. And I should mention, I will not go in every detail in this video. So for all the details, for all the sources, I'd like to refer you to this article. But now let's get on with this. What do I want to look at you? Standard structure, introduction, material methods, results, discussion. And now, without further ado, the introduction. So, I want to have a brief look, briefly characterizing COVID-19 pandemic, and that's about the main anti-corona measures. And here, as our research took place in Germany, focus on the German measures. The corona pandemic and the countermeasures affected the social lives of nearly everyone. Therefore, in section 1.3, a look at the social spheres, and then for structuring the evaluation of complex and or severe events, one approach might be the theory of planned behavior, which I will briefly introduce in section 1.4. Based on all of this in section 1.5, I would like to show you our hypothesized model and the research questions. But now to the COVID-19 pandemic. As far as we know, it started in China in December 2019. It's a highly infectious disease and it spread all over the globe. And of course, not to forget to mention, it can have some severe impact on the individual's health, with, in the worst case, results in death. The death toll is globally mounting and rising by the day. Against this massive threat, virtually all countries, all governments took severe measures that impacted the social lives of people, even impacting their basic or civil rights. And the main idea was to stop the virus from spreading, so reducing social contacts. Some of the main measures you see here, and these were taken in Germany, not only, but amongst other countries. On the 23rd of March, the German Chancellor announced the measures, here restriction on outdoor activities. People should reduce or had to reduce their contacts to other people outside their own household. There's social distancing in place, meaning you should keep your distance to others by at least 1.5 or 2 meters. Restaurants, pubs, shops, hairdressers and so on were all closed. That was at the core of the anti-corona measures. And the second main aspect was the tips for hygiene. Very similar in every country, so it's not only a German thing. So you have the coughing and sneezing etiquettes. You should avoid touching other people's, so no handshakes, no embracing and such things. and wash your hands regularly and properly, and a few more tips you get there. Thirdly, we wanted to examine the tips for mental health. That is not of German origin, but it comes from the Institute Mental Health Europe. But there's a German version of it, and we thought it could be very insightful to see what do people think during the first phase of the pandemic about their mental health. As we all know, severe events can lead to or can have a massive negative impact on the mental health rather than the long run. So some advices of this mental health tips or maintaining a sense of hope and positive thinking, you should reach out to others and look for support for yourself, but also support others. And if you feel or if you have the impression you're under immense stress and you can slide into problems like a depression, you should definitely seek professional help. These are the main anti-corona measures, and these 3 measures we examine in our empirical study. So as you can see here, restrictions on outdoor activities, tips for hygiene, social distancing, that affects the social life. Therefore, we had a look at the social spheres of people. First of all, human life in general, apart from all the pandemic ideas or pandemic thing, takes place in a social context. A human life without social context and without social contacts is unthinkable. Health also, apart from the pandemic, has a social component. But with the pandemic, you actually can see how relevant the social aspect is, as COVID-19 is transferred when having social contacts, and the countermeasures as well affect the social lives of the people. So we defined 4 social spheres: the close family, the wider family and friends, the colleagues at work, and the society in general. That is not only because of looking at the pandemic and the countermeasures. You can also find this mirrored in the general social psychological categorization of groups, where you can say the first 2, close family and wider family and friends, are rather kind of an intimacy group. The colleagues at work, they are rather task group, and the society in general can be associated with a social category or a loose association. Next, to the theory of planned behavior. Why did we choose the theory of planned behavior to structure our evaluation model? The theory of planned behavior is what I think a wonderful framework to understand the complexities of human decisions and behaviors. So, the human brain does not work in simple ways. We're not often conscious about the processes that go around in our brains. However, these processes can be rather complex. Our theory of planned behavior is a very good approach. Furthermore, the theory of planned behavior could be applied in health-related fields and also in pro-environmental decision-making and behaviors. As you can see here, health, COVID-19 pandemic, perfect match, and with the social aspect of the pandemic and of health in general, pro-environmental behavior and decisions, it actually makes sense. There are other very good models like the health belief model, but in this case we decided against it, just took the theory of planned behavior. And I want to briefly tell you what is the theory of planned behavior. And firstly, I should tell you that the original theory of planned behavior was to explain decisions or to explain behavior. We, on the other hand, use the theory to evaluate attitudinal objects, in this case, the anti-corona measures. The theory of planned behavior consists of three constructs: the attitude, the subjective norm, and the perceived behavioral control. The attitude can be understood in the original theory as an individual's positive or negative evaluation of consequences that will result from a specific behavior. In our case, you can understand the attitude as perceived protection from the coronavirus and its consequences. The subjective norm can be understood as some sort of social pressure. So what does an individual feel of the opinion of others, and does the individual feel that it should follow these opinions? So in our case, willingness to fulfill the expectations of others. Perceived behavioral control, from the original theory, is an individual's perception of their own capacities and constraints of performing a specific behavior. We here understand it as the perceived practicability of anti-corona measures. So, having now the anti-corona measures, the social spheres that are affected by the pandemic and the anti-corona measures, and the theory of planned behavior with its three constructs, we can bring this all together in one model. And that is here our hypothesized model, meaning how on the top the evaluation of an anti-corona measure and how good I evaluate this depends on my attitude, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control. And these constructs on the middle level depend on the social spheres. So under each construct, attitude, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control, there are the four social spheres: close family, wider family and friends, colleagues at work, and society in general. We have three main research questions that derive from this model and from the theoretical background I've just described. So we ask ourselves, which relevance do the attitude, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control, as well as the social spheres, have for the people's evaluation of anti-corona measures? That is the subjective relevance. We also want to see how good do people think these measures were for these constructs. Therefore, our second research question is, how well do people evaluate anti-corona measures, restrictions on outdoor activities, tips for hygiene, and tips for mental health, with regards to their attitude, subjective norm, perceived behavioral control, and with regards to their social spheres. Finally, based on the results or the answers to the first two research questions, we want to find out how governments can improve anti-corona measures from the people's perspective. Therefore, the third main research question is, what is the potential of and the need for increasing the effectiveness of anti-corona measures from the people's perspective, and with what priority should the current effectiveness of these measures be secured or increased with regard to attitude, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control within the social spheres of people. Now let's come to the method. I would like to show you the research design and the measurement which we conducted with a means-end theory of complex cognitive structures. We collected our data using an online questionnaire. We did this during the time of the 25th of March until the 15th of April 2020, so it was during the first wave of the pandemic in Germany. It was also the time when the strictest governmental measures were in place. On the 22nd of March, the German Chancellor announced the restrictions on outdoor activities. On the 15th of April, she announced easing these measures. Eventually, 663 completed questionnaires resulted. Our participants were business psychology students in Germany, but they were not only students, they were also fully integrated in the workforce. So these students, they study and work parallelly in full-time jobs. Therefore, we believe that we could gain very good insights into the heart of the German population. The average age of our participants was 26.73 years, with a standard deviation of 5.03 years. Just shy of 3/4 of our sample were female and the rest were male. Let's come to the measurement. As I've mentioned before, we used the means-end theory of complex cognitive structures. This method is not well known yet, therefore I would like to go in a bit more detail, but not every detail. The beauty of this method is that you can actually measure complex attitudinal systems, as we have here, what you can see again our model on the top right. But back to our first research question, we wanted to find out what is of relevance to the people. Therefore, we used a continuous rating scale from 0, not important, to 100, very important. And we asked people how important the following items are to them: protection from disease and its consequences, fulfilling the expectations of others, and the practicability of anti-corona measures. So these 3 items were representing the attitude, the subjective norm, and the perceived behavioral control. We also used the continuous rating scale from not important to very important, 0 to 100, for the social spheres. So we asked, how important is the protection of the close family? How important is the protection of the wider family and friends? How important is the protection of the colleagues at work? And how important is the protection of the society in general? The measurement for the social spheres on the subjective norm and perceived behavioral controls were conducted accordingly. Now, with the means-end theory of complex cognitive structures, you need to calculate further variables. The first is the normed value. And the normed value is the empirical value of one element divided by the empirical value, the sum of the empirical values of all the other elements that are beneath one higher element on one level. So in our case, the norm value for the attitude would be the empirical value measured from 0, not important, to 100, very important. The empirical value of the attitude divided by empirical value of the attitude plus the empirical value of the subjective norm plus the empirical value of the perceived behavioral control. This is what you do for the lowest level in the same way. So the norm value for the close family with regards to the attitude is the empirical value of close family divided by the sum of all of these 4 empirical values. The norm values can range from 0 to 1, and in its sum underneath one element and on the same level they will equate to 1. So we know with the norm values the impact of one element on its superior element. So for instance, the impact of the close family on the attitude. And again, the impact of the attitude of the overall evaluation of an anti-corona measure. So far, what we do not know is what is the impact or the influence of an element of the lowest level on the overall evaluation of an anti-corona measure. So for instance, the impact the close family, the protection of the close family has on the evaluation of the overall corona measure. For this, we need the total norm value. And that is simply the multiplication of the norm value of the lowest level with the normed value of its superior level element. So, for example, the total norm value of the protection of the close family would be the normed value of the protection of the close family times the normed value of the attitude. But it's not only about the relevance. We had a second research question, and that's how are the anti-corona measures evaluated? So we were examining the restrictions on outdoor activities, tips for hygiene, and the tips for mental health. Here we empirically measured only on the lowest level of our model. So we ask, how good is the protection for the close family, for the wider family and friends, for the colleagues at work, for the society in general? And for the three measures, once for the restrictions on outdoor activity, then again for the tips for hygiene, and again for the tips for mental health. Subjective norm and perceived behavioral control were done accordingly. We also used a continuous rating scale from 0, not good, to 100, very good. As we have only empirically measured the elements of the lowest level, we need to calculate the elements of the higher level. So the attitude, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control. And then in the end, the evaluation of the quality, subjective quality of the overall anti-corona measure. The equation for that is on the bottom here of the slide. And the calculated quality is the sum of the normed values multiplied by the empirical quality. Through this, or you can calculate the qualities of the middle level. So, norm value times quality of close family plus norm value of the wider family and friends times the respective quality plus norm value and quality of colleagues at work, and again plus the norm value and quality of the society in general. And we have the quality of the attitude. After we've done the same for the subjective norm and the perceived behavioral control, we again can do the same procedure for these three elements for the respective anti-corona measure. Our third research question was about how to improve anti-corona measures. Within the means end theory of complex cognitive structures, you can sort of automatically derive norm strategies. And this, I hope, becomes apparent by showing you this matrix here. On the x-axis, we have the subjective quality from 0, not good, to 100, very good. On the y-axis is the total norm value or the norm values. This is always from 0 to 1 and it's sum 1. We can now divide the matrix into 4 quadrants. And the division is done by the mean over all the elements. Let's go through the quadrants on the top left. Well, perhaps firstly, I should mention that you can understand the subjective quality as the need, or corresponding with the need of improving or increasing effectiveness. If you're good at something, you don't need to do much. If you're bad, of course, you have the need to improve. The normed value, on the other hand, corresponds with the potential of increasing the effectiveness of elements or measures. If it's a high norm value, if an element has a high relevance to the people and has with it a higher impact on the overall evaluation, the potential is higher. Right, now let's go to the quadrants on the top left. So, relatively important to the people and perceived with a relative poor quality. That means the potential for increasing the effectiveness is high. The need is high as well. That means here you need to increase the effectiveness with the first priority. Going to the top right, elements that are highly or relatively highly important and are relatively well perceived by the people. That means high potential for increasing the effectiveness, but the need for increasing the effectiveness is low. That would lead to a norm strategy of primarily securing the effectiveness of these elements with a first priority. Of course, you normally can always improve something, but mainly securing the effectiveness here. Going one down to the bottom right. So, relatively low normed values, relatively high perceived quality, which means the potential for increasing the effectiveness is low and the need for increasing the effectiveness is low as well. The norm strategy that follows is securing the effectiveness but with a lower priority. To the bottom left, relatively low relevance and relatively low perceived quality. That means potential for increasing the effectiveness is low, but the need for increasing the effectiveness is high. And that means here we need to increase the effectiveness, do some improvements here, but it has a lower priority. We also had a few additional variables, always using continuous rating scales from 0 to 100. We ask how well the people felt informed about the COVID-19 pandemic from 0 not good to 100 very good. We ask for the relevance of information sources from not important to very important, 0 to 100. We use the social spheres with the exception of the society in general and added classic media and new media. Finally, we ask for the perceived threat level on a scale from 0 not threatening to 100 very threatening. And here we use the 4 social spheres that also form the core or some of the core elements of our research model. So family, wider family and friends, colleagues at work, and society in general. After being through the method, I would like to show you the results of our study. And as before, I would like to go through subjective relevance of the elements of our model, then the quality of those based on these, on section 3.3, the norm strategies for optimizing anti-corona measures, and finally, I want to show you the results for the additional variables. First, have a look at the subjective relevance, the empirical normed and total normed values. I do not want to go through every number here. If you'd like to have a more detailed look, pause the video, have a look, or look in the article, which is freely available. On this table, you see firstly here the 3 elements of the middle level of our model: the attitude, subjective norm, perceived behavioral control, which can be translated into the protection from the COVID-19 pandemic, the willingness to fulfill the expectation of others, and the practicability of anti-corona measures. Then we come to the social spheres: close family, wider family and friends, colleagues at work, society in general, and for the attitude, subjective norm and perceived behavioral control. First set of columns is the empirical value and the norm value, and on the last set of columns to the right, the total norm value. I said I do not want to go through every number, however, you can see some patterns emerging. And especially clear becomes here at the start. Look at the norm value of the 3 middle elements of our model. So the attitude In other words, the perceived protection from COVID-19 is of highest relevance, closely followed by the practicability of anti-corona measures or the perceived behavioral control, and then with a gap so substantially more important than the subjective norm, or in other words, the willingness to fulfill the expectations of others. With regards to social spheres, you can also see a pattern emerging that becomes especially apparent here. The normed values underneath the subjective norm. So, most important to the people is the close family, and that is followed on a similar level of each, the wider family and friends, colleagues at work, and society in general. So that means, again, to summarize this, the perceived protection from COVID-19 is more important than the practicability of anti-corona measures, which is in turn substantially more important than the willingness to fulfill the expectation of others. And the close family is substantially more important than the wider family and friends, colleagues at work, and society in general, whereby the latter three are on a similar level. Secondly, the subjective or subjectively perceived quality. Each set of columns represents one anti-corona measure. Firstly, the restrictions on outdoor activities, then the tips for hygiene, and to the right, the tips for mental health. Firstly, all of these measures are perceived relatively well by the German population or by the German people. As, remember, the scale is 0 not good to 100 very good. They're all going to the upper end. What is received best is the tips for hygiene, followed by the restrictions on outdoor activities, with a gap then to the tips for mental health. If you look within these measures, the attitude and the perceived behavioral control are roughly on the same level. And they are on a higher quality level or perceived quality level than the willingness to fulfill the expectation of others, the subjective norm. Here is a more detailed look into the social spheres. Again, the social spheres underneath the element attitude, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control, and the three anti-corona measures we examined, the restrictions on outdoor activity, tips for mental health, tips for hygiene, and then to the right, tips for mental health. And what we can see here is that, again, here in subjective norm, you can properly see this, and in others as well, like the attitude, tips for hygiene, attitude. The close family and the wider family and friends are roughly on the same level, and they are perceived better. So a higher quality is attributed to these elements or these social spheres than to the colleagues at work and the society in general, which also are roughly on the same level across all the three measures. Thirdly, now the norm strategies. On the x-axis, as shown before, is the empirical quality from 0 not good to 100 very good. The y-axis, the total normed value. And what you can see, firstly on the bottom, the subjective norm is relatively unimportant. It's always on the bottom half. The top half, and here we have to look at the quadrants, the top right, we have the attitude and perceived behavioral control for the close family and the wider family and friends. The society in general and the colleagues at work on the top left quadrant, here with the exception of the attitude, of the society in general. That is the results for the restrictions on outdoor activities. You can now derive the norm strategies that always what is top left. Here, the effectiveness needs to be increased or should be increased with first priority. Top right, so close family and friends and wider family and friends, the effectiveness should be secured with first priority, whilst the subjective norm has second priority, either in increasing or securing the effectiveness. Let's have a look at the tips for hygiene. It's a similar picture. Again, the subjective norm on the bottom half, whilst the close family and friends, the close family and the wider family and friends on the top right quadrant, and the society in general and colleagues are at work with regards to both attitude and perceived behavioral control on the top left quadrant, with the exception here, perceived behavioral control for the colleagues at work. Again, we could apply the same norm strategies. Finally, the tips for mental health. Again, I'm sorry that I can't give you any surprising turn, but again, the same pattern. Subjective norm on the bottom half, whilst close family and wider family and friends on the top right quadrant, and society in general and colleagues at work, the top left quadrant. Here's the exception, the perceived protection or the protection, the quality of the protection of the colleagues at work that just slipped into the top right quadrant. Norm strategies accordingly, as we've seen in the matrices before. Additional variables we had: subjective information level, and on the scale from 0, not good informed, to 100, very good informed, the people have as a mean 69.16, with a rather, say, good standard deviation of 21.03. The relevance of the information sources, from not important to very important, 0 to 100. Most important is classic media, followed by new media, and then with a gap there's the close family, colleagues at work, and finally the wider family and friends. Perceived threat level. The highest threat is attributed to society in general, followed by the close family, the wider family and friends, and finally the colleagues at work. There's not a high threat level seen with regards to this social sphere. Finally, the discussion. Here, following our main structure that goes through all of the article and also this presentation. First, about the people's expectations on governmental initiatives and measures, then how people evaluate these initiatives and measures, then improving initiatives and measures, and finally the limitations and an outlook. As I've shown you, the perceived protection from COVID-19, the attitude, is more important than the practicability of anti-corona measures, and the practicability is substantially more important than the willingness to fulfill the expectations of others. What is surprising, other studies come to different results. They state that for health beneficial behavior, the attitude and the subjective norm have the highest relevance. I have to state here, or have to mention here, these studies mainly focus on daily health beneficial behavior, like seat belts or bicycle helmets. It's probably hard to compare or to draw comparisons here, to make comparisons here, as a severe crisis like COVID-19 probably has a larger impact on people, or a higher relevance for people than sort of normal daily behavior. You can understand the normed values as the people's expectations on governmental initiatives and measures. And our results indicate that policymakers should focus on the utility for people when designing and implementing anti-corona measures or measures in a case of a similar crisis. And that means protection and practicability. That has to come first. It also looks like that people individually assess anti-corona measures and they do not form their opinions based on social interactions. That is also backed by the relevance of the media channels. If you remember, classic media has the highest relevance and by far the highest relevance. But here you have to say at least people think so, that they individually and in a completely rational way form their opinion. However, you have to keep this in mind if you're a policymaker, and therefore policymakers should comprehensively and factually communicate and explain anti-corona measures. Our data suggest that it is absolutely wrong to launch campaigns that have some sort of social pressure, like "what would your grandmother say?" or something like this. Other key results of our study were, in the context of the norm values, that the close family is substantially more important to the people than the wider family and friends, colleagues at work, society in general. And these three social spheres are roughly on one level when it comes to the relevance. So that is not really surprising that the close family is of highest relevance, as we can assume that is normally the group with the highest emotional closeness. What is, however, surprising is that the wider family and friends are not more important to the people with regards to anti-corona measures than the colleagues at work and the society in general. Again, coming from the emotional closeness point. One explanation here might be that we have some cultural impact here or cultural influences. We collected our data in Germany. Germany is a highly individualistic country, or culture has a highly individualistic culture. Also, there's a tendency in developed countries that you focus more on individualism, meaning on yourself and your nuclear family. The people's expectations on governmental initiatives mainly focus on protection of the close family and the practicability within this social sphere. Therefore, two questions should be at the absolute core of designing and communicating anti-corona measures. And again, always from the people's perspective. And that is, how do the close families benefit from these initiatives and measures? Secondly, how can close families integrate these measures in their daily lives with a relative ease? That does not mean that policymakers should forget about the other social spheres, but they should be integrated in the design and communication of initiatives as sort of a secondary initiative or secondary aspect. Now let's come to the evaluation or the attributed quality to the governmental initiatives and measures. First of all the anti-corona measures were perceived relatively well by the German people. What we could find out is that the tips for hygiene are evaluated or rated better than restrictions on outdoor activities, and these in turn – substantially better than tips for mental health. the perceived protection from COVID-19 and the practicability of anti-corona measures, again the quality, was on a relatively even level, so comparable. And this was substantially better than the willingness to fulfill the expectations of others. So again, coming to the quality, the close family and the wider family and friends were roughly on the same level, and this level was better than the one of the colleagues at work and the society in general. Firstly, tips for hygiene and restrictions on outdoor activities better than mental health. That indicates that people seem to focus more on the immediate threat of severe events than on long-term consequences, which can and most likely will come during or after this COVID-19 pandemic. Furthermore, we can see that the order of the perceived quality mirrors the order of the subjective relevance that we had a look at before, and that can lead to two conclusions. So one conclusion might be the government actually designed the measures and communicated them according to the expectations of the people. On the other hand, it can mean that governmental statements and the media coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic and the anti-corona measures influenced people's opinions. And that is also shown in other research, for instance, the media coverage and the perceived threat level after the 9/11 attacks, terror attacks in the US 2001. Furthermore, the quality of the small or emotionally close groups is higher than of the more emotionally more distant groups. That indicates, or we could come to the conclusion, that people might believe that their individual behavior has a larger impact on the smaller sized and emotionally closer groups, and also that they can trust these groups' members more to thoroughly apply the anti-corona measures. The next subsection here is about how governments can improve their initiatives and measures with regards to corona or in case of a similar crisis. And firstly, I would like to stress that I can only say something based on the people's perception and evaluation. I cannot say anything based on medical reasons or medical expertise or other expertise. So all what I'm telling you here is you have to keep in mind it's only based on people's expectations and evaluation. Coming to the key results, I could show you, I hope, that the willingness to fulfill the expectations of others, the subjective norm, was of below average relevance to the people. What was of above average relevance was the protection of the colleagues at work and the society in general from COVID-19 and the practicability of anti-corona measures in these two social spheres. It was above average relevance, but below average quality as perceived by the people. Above average quality was the protection and the practicability of measures for the close family and the wider family and friends on the top right of this matrix. So what does this mean? First of all, I have to say that all of the recent anti-corona measures have room for improvement. We can show that none of the measures and no element of the measures was evaluated top, so that would mean 100 out of the scale, 0 not good to 100 very good. So there's for all measures on all elements, there's room for improvement. But what does it mean for policymakers? From the people's perspective, and in case of a similar crisis, policymakers can build on the recent measures with regards to protecting the close family and the wider family and friends, and the practicability of the recent measures in these social spheres. They should, however, improve the effectiveness and the practicability of anti-corona measures for the society in general and the colleagues at work. And what policymakers should not do is applying any form of social pressure. As I mentioned before, campaigns, "What would your grandmother say?" or something similar. We definitely advise against this. However, that doesn't mean that encouraging people to communicate with each other might be beneficial with some other objectives, perhaps, and based on our data here, it should be considered with a very low priority. And what policymakers definitely should do, they should conduct an in-depth analysis of the recent measures based on the aforementioned aspects to improve future initiatives. And you have to keep in mind these initiatives and measures severely affect people's lives. Finally, limitations and outlook. I've mentioned before, surprisingly enough, the subjective norm was of relatively low relevance to the people. That is in contrast to other findings. I mentioned this, so here further examination would make sense. One explanation I was given that might be the case was a cultural aspect. So in this context, a cross-cultural replication of this study could make sense and could lead to fruitful results. And I mentioned one or two points that the German culture, as a very individualistic and a low context culture, might have had an impact on the results. Furthermore, that is important, this study was conducted during the first phase of the pandemic in Germany. So we do not know how people think now. Therefore, it would be a longitudinal study to uncover the development of the people's evaluation. That could be rather interesting. We also neglected the influence of personality, habits and traits, or the individual situation in life on the evaluation of anti-corona measures. Here it is probably advised to use experimental designs. Also is pointed out that one explanation for the same pattern of relevance and quality across the elements of this model here might be attributed to the media influence. That is also an area where more research should be undertaken. Finally, probably most important, I mentioned this on the slide before, the next step which can have an immediate and very beneficial impact on the lives of millions of people, would be correlating the technical elements of the recent anti-corona measures with the evaluation criteria, the elements of our model here, to improve the initiatives and measures countering severe crises like corona, and also improve the communication of these measures. So we're at the end, and I hope you could get some helpful information out of this video. And I remember I said at the start it will be 30 minutes or so. I think it's slightly more, which is a serious understatement. So if you come to this point, I thank you for your attention, and I say goodbye for now and wish you all the best.